Well, today is the last Sunday of the Christian liturgical year. I don't know if you knew that. Next Sunday is New Year's Sunday on the church calendar. Advent, the first Sunday of Advent, is the first Sunday of the Christian year. But today, the last Sunday of this current year, is Christ the King Sunday. Advent begins next week with all the anticipated decorations and the celebration and anticipation of the coming of the Savior. In fact, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, we're going to be decorating. So if you want to come and help us decorate the church tomorrow morning, you can do that. We're going to be really excited next Sunday to come in and see everything up for Advent. But before we go there, the liturgical calendar is going to remind us where this story is leading. That the baby in the manger that we will celebrate is actually the world's true king. And that reality is something that we celebrate. But we have to remember that the coming of Jesus, Israel's Messiah, God's anointed king, was not and still is not joyous news to everyone. See, when we claim the earliest Christian creed, Jesus Christ is Lord, it was and is a direct challenge to the principalities and powers of this world. Christ the King Sunday thus puts this conflict, this clash of kingdoms into perspective. And nowhere do we see that more clearly than in the lectionary gospel text for this Sunday, the confrontation between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. Now, we usually read this text on Good Friday. A lot of times we just keep it in that little box, but I think it's a really important text for us because it serves as an example of the contrast between the kind of kingdom that Jesus is bringing in and the kingdoms of this world, both in the first century and now. But to understand that confrontation, we really need to understand the players. We've talked a lot about Jesus over the last several weeks as we finished our series on the Apostles' Creed. Actually, we talk about Jesus every Sunday because that's what we do, right? But we mentioned Pontius Pilate in the Creed, remember? But few people know a lot about Pontius Pilate. I think he's an interesting character in the story. But understanding him and knowing his motivation, I think, is one of the keys that unlocks our understanding of how the powers of this world actually work and how the presence of a battered and bruised and yet unbowed Jesus represents the real truth about how royal power works. Now, so I'm going to give you a little background on Pontius Pilate today and sort of heighten this contrast that brings us to this place where they are in conflict with one another there in Jerusalem. Now, Pilate, of course, is an actual historical figure for whom we have both documentary and archaeological evidence. In 1961, archaeologists were excavating the theater in Caesarea, named after Caesar. It was a city that was built by Herod the Great on the coast of the Mediterranean there in Israel. And they were excavating a theater that had been rebuilt in the 4th century. And they discovered a stone that had been repurposed and was used for one of the steps. And on that stone was a fragmentary inscription. The archaeologists discovered this inscription that said this: De Augustus Tiberium Pontius Pilatus Prefectus Judaei. Now, you all know Latin, right? So you got that figured out. Well, filling in the blanks of the stone, weathered by the elements, trampled by centuries of Roman feet, the archaeologists recognized this as a dedication stone from a long-lost building that was constructed to honor the Emperor Tiberius, who was the Roman ruler at the time of Jesus' adulthood. But this building was built by the Prefectus Judaei, the prefect of Judea, one Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilatus. Here was the first physical evidence of the man who sentenced Jesus to death. Evidence that he existed. found in the place where he actually spent most of his time during his decade-long tenure as the emperor's representative in one of the easternmost parts of the Roman Empire. The Gospels mention Pontius Pilate, of course, all four of them, but so do a couple of other Jewish historians of that period, Josephus and Philo. But Pontius Pilate otherwise is kind of a historical curiosity who had his only 15 minutes of fame, or infamy, if you will, on a Friday morning in Jerusalem when he was confronted with this case of a bloodied and beaten Jewish prophet from Galilee whom the Jewish authorities wanted crucified. We want to know more about Pontius Pilate, and because of that, some different traditions have emerged about his origins. Some traditions have him coming from Spain or from the forests of Germania, but the most plausible of these stories has him growing up as part of the Roman knightly class, the son of a career soldier. Most Roman governors of the period were knights of the empire, or who were sons of knights, and so we can infer that Pilate spent most of his young life in relative wealth, getting a good education in mathematics and rhetoric, reading and writing and philosophy, and training for a career in the military, which was the best path for advancement for ambitious young Romans. He would have spent his time currying the favor of some potential wealthy patrons who could secure him a good billet. Usually these wealthy men had very good political connections. So if Pilate served in the army, that service might have taken him away from home for years. He may have fought in the campaigns of the Emperor Tiberius against the German barbarians in the early first century. But wherever that service took him, he no doubt dreamed of the day when he would rise to a posting of honor conveyed by the emperor himself, an opportunity to make a name for himself. He may have managed to wrestle a commission to be one of the emperor's Praetorian Guard, where he caught the eye of the commander, Sejanus, who had the emperor's ear. Some traditions suggest, on the other hand, that it was his marriage to Claudia Procula, an illegitimate daughter of Claudia, Tiberius's third wife. Did you get all that? Okay. That put him in a position to be the emperor's good graces. The Romans were nothing if not nepotistic, right? Whatever happened to set him up for it, one day he received his imperial promotion. And it would have come to him on a 5-leafed wax tablet, the official form, with orders sending him to be governor of Judea. Pilate must have seen this with some ambivalence. He was important enough to the emperor to be appointed as a governor, but not important enough to receive a truly meaningful and prestigious post, because Judea was on the eastern edge of the empire, and it was a nowhere place. It was as far from the center of Rome as you could get. But nonetheless, no doubt disappointed, Pilate arrived in Judea in the year 26, just about the time that Jesus began his public ministry in Galilee. He must have thought that if he did well in this minor posting, the emperor would notice and perhaps make sure that he would get another posting. So Pilate is going to do everything he can to make sure that the Emperor Tiberius's name is plastered everywhere, because he knows his fate is tied to the emperor's friendship. Philo and Josephus pick up the story here. They tell of Pilate's hatred of the Jews. He demonstrated that first by setting up Roman standards in the temple. Remember, he wants Tiberius's name everywhere, and so he sets up these Roman pagan standards in the Jewish temple. What's the problem with that? Well, there's this little thing called the Ten Commandments. And the idea that no graven images can be set up, no graven images in places of worship. And so Pilate gets in trouble with the Jews. In fact, they riot and protest, and they actually go from Jerusalem there in the mountains down to the coast to Caesarea, where Pilate spends most of his time, and they go in a mass protest. And Pilate gathers them all into the theater to speak with them, and basically his message to them is, if you don't knock it off, I'm going to kill every one of you. But instead of backing down, this large crowd of people in that theater get down on their knees and they bare their necks. And they say, we would rather die than have our temple desecrated. Well, now Pilate's faced with a dilemma, doesn't want to have mass murder on his hand, so he backs down. Later on, he decides to use some of the money in the temple treasury to build an aqueduct in Jerusalem. This causes another riot, but this time Pilate was ready. He disguised some of his soldiers as civilians among the crowd, and when the riot was going on at a prearranged signal, the soldiers threw off their civilian clothes, pulled their swords, and began to hack their way and through the crowd to break up the protest. The stampede ensued and many were killed. This may be the event that Jesus refers to in Luke 8 or Luke 13, the Galileans whose blood Pilate mixed with their sacrifices. The historian Philo reports that Pilate didn't learn from any of these incidents. In fact, it got worse. In another incident, the Herodian royal family, remember the family of Herod the Great, they sent word to Rome of his actions, which resulted in an imperial reprimand. Now, I want you to think about this. This is the family of Herod the Great. What's Herod the Great famous for in the Gospels? Yes, slaughtering the babies of Jerusalem. If the family of King Herod thinks you're bad, you're bad. You're very, very bad. But the scant record reveals that Pilate was a man caught between two conflicting poles. On the one hand, he is bound and determined to do the exact opposite of what his Jewish subjects wanted. And on the other hand, he's driven by the fear of what the emperor will think if news of his troublemaking makes it back to Rome. In the account of Jesus' trial in John's gospel, the words that shake Pilate the most are those that are spoken by the Jewish leaders, who know which button they need to push on Pilate to get what they want. They say to Pilate, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." Being Caesar's friend was everything to Pilate. The trial of Jesus then reveals Pilate's political pragmatism. All four of the Gospels fill in the details of this trial and Jesus' exchanges with Pilate. It's interesting to speculate on what Pilate must have thought when he's looking at this young Jewish prophet standing in front of him. They say he's the king of the Jews, but he doesn't look like royalty. He has no army. He just has this ragtag group of followers. If he was truly trying to be king of the Jews, well, he wasn't alone. There were plenty of people trying to drive out the Romans and wrest power for themselves, not least Barabbas, who was rotting in the dungeon below, who we'll meet a little bit later in the Passion narrative. This bloodied and beaten man standing before him was no ordinary pretender to the throne, however. But apparently the Jewish leaders were foaming at the mouth about him, wanting him dead. And given Pilate's propensity to give the Jewish leaders the opposite of what they wanted, Pilate was predisposed to release him just to frustrate them. John's version of the story, if you read it closely, and there's more to it than the verses that Ben read for us. It's actually a pretty extensive piece of John 18. You notice that the trial keeps moving outside to the crowd and inside in the palace. Pilate's talking with the crowd, then he goes inside to talk with Jesus. Pilate knows that the crowd can't come into the home of a Gentile lest it make them unclean for the Passover meal. But inside, Pilate questions Jesus. And the first question he asks is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Imagine Pilate asking that question. Probably pretty sarcastically. Not a chance this man is a king. But let's humor ourselves here. He's good at conversation. Maybe he's a philosopher. Pilate certainly knew the type. Shifty, always answering questions with more questions. In fact, Jesus answers with a question. Do you ask me this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Pilate is slightly offended. I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? To his surprise, Jesus offers a political answer. My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Now, sometimes that gets translated, my kingdom is not of this world, as though it's a distant, faraway kingdom. No, it's not from this world. That's what ek, that preposition means in Greek. In other words, it's not the kind of kingdom that you expect, that you serve, that you are looking for. My kingdom comes from another place. It's not from this world. But as we know, it's certainly for this world. And here's the core of the story: the clash between two kingdoms. Pilate represents the kind of kingdom that typically comes from this world, a kingdom in which power is a commodity to buy and sell, a kingdom built on fear and force of arms, a kingdom where people are stratified based on their social class, their wealth, their influence, a kingdom where there are insiders and outsiders. So Pilate can't understand what Jesus is talking about, and he has no idea what to do with him. It's outside of any of his categories. If this man claims to be a king, and he'd seen a lot of people who had aspired to that, then why doesn't he fight for it? Or at least, why doesn't he try to bribe me into letting him go? He has nothing. He rules nothing. And seemingly, he is nothing. He's only useful insofar as Pilate can use him to poke these riotous Jews in the eye one more time. Pilate sees nothing wrong with Jesus from that standpoint, at least in terms of his Roman understanding of power. This man's not a threat. He's harmless, more of a philosopher than a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, Jesus says, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate hears this, and in response, he utters the famous question: what is truth? What is truth? See, for Pilate, anything that got him advanced in status in the eyes of the emperor was truth. For Pilate, truth is whatever I decide it is, whatever is most pragmatic. It's kind of like throwing darts at the wall and drawing targets around it and saying you hit the bullseye. I think Pilate actually would have been right at home in our 21st century world, where today truth is always relative. People make their own truth. I live my own truth, etc., etc. But Jesus is talking about a different kind of truth than Pilate, than Tiberius, than modern people, that even people in Jewish people in Jesus' own day could see. See, what Jesus is saying here is that truth is actually a person. Earlier in John's gospel, Jesus had declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Even earlier in John's gospel, in the prologue, chapter 1, the hidden truth is revealed that God actually put on flesh and lived among us. And John says, we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. See, Pilate doesn't realize that ultimate truth is standing right there in front of him. That the world's true emperor didn't live in a palace in Rome. Actually, Tiberius, the emperor at the time, had left Rome and decided to take a permanent vacation on the Isle of Capri, kind of ruling in absentia. This king was doing something completely different. Instead of seeking power, this Jesus, this king, was giving it away. Instead of by arms and fear, he was ruling instead with the force of love. Instead of seeking his own advancement, he's seeking downward mobility. He's talking about being a slave. Instead of seeing people stratified into categories, the only category he cares about is obedience to his Father. Pilate doesn't know what to do with Jesus. So he does the thing that is most politically expedient for himself. He gives the crowd what they want so that they will not complain to the emperor again. I think this is why Pontius Pilate, of all people, shows up in the Apostles' Creed. Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, which puts Jesus' crucifixion squarely in the midst of history. But his suffering under a duplicitous Roman governor was actually a triumph. Pilate had the chance to do the right thing and release Jesus. That would have been the just thing to do. But Pilate's not interested in justice. He's interested in his own skin, which was tied to being a friend of the emperor. In Matthew's gospel, he literally washes his hands of the responsibility for Jesus' death, which is a cynical irony given that he is the only one who really has the power to decide his fate. It's the contrast between the rulers of this world and the world's true ruler, the one who dies for his people rather than threatening them with death. Pilate cares about himself more than about justice, while Jesus cares about justifying his people through his own death. Now, one of the final acts of Pilate there in the Gospels is to take a sign and to nail it on the cross above Jesus' head that says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He has it written so that everyone can understand it. He has it written in Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so that everybody can understand it. And this infuriates the Jewish leaders because they say, you can't say he's king of the Jews, say he said he was king of the Jews. And what is Pilate's response? What I have written, I have written. What Pilate doesn't know is that he's nailed the truth above Jesus' head. He meant it to be ironic, to upset the Jewish leaders, but it was the truth. From there, Pilate disappears from the biblical record. Josephus adds a little bit of detail. In 36 AD, Pilate is recalled to Rome after another incident where he used violence instead of tact in order to deal with a situation in Samaria. In the year 37, Tiberius, the one on whom Pilate had staked his hopes and dreams, dies at the age of 78. Pilate's career dies with him. When he left Judea, Pilate disappears from history. He had hoped that his name would live forever, but instead it wound up being walked on for centuries by people who didn't know who the faded words on the stepping stone referred to. He wanted to make a name for himself, but his name now is only associated in contrast with the one whose name is above all names. Christ the King Sunday confronts us with the same questions that Pilate is asking. Are you a king then? Jesus is the once present and future king. His power is not exercised in palaces or with violence, but it is the power of servanthood, the power of love. Clones of Pilate and Caesar abound in this world, seeking power and patronage and their own upward advancement. Jesus shows us that real kingship is born out of service, out of giving oneself away. If we believe Jesus is king, we will live like subjects who mirror his posture of humility and sacrificial love. Advent will remind us that the world's true king was not born in luxury, but in a barn among the poorest of the poor. It's among those people that he will live and work, bringing hope and healing and new life. And he calls us to join him there. His kingdom is not from this world. It's not the kind of kingdom we normally think of, the kind where people vie for dominance over one another. Matthew 20, Jesus tells his disciples, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Our true king is the one who serves, who gives his life for others. Pilate asks, what is truth? Well, if we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then all the other claims of truth will be measured against him and his word. You say that I am a king, Jesus tells Pilate. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me. In a world where the principalities and powers offer us only fake news and alternative facts, Jesus speaks the truth because he is the truth. So as we prepare for Advent, and as we live on the other side of an election and in the wake of another power struggle among the kingdoms of this world, and make no mistake, every time you look at the news, that's the power struggle that's going on. Let us remember the one who stands before the emperor's representative and speaks truth, because he is truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. May we give him our ultimate allegiance. Amen.